Hi, I'm Peter Coroneos from the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, CYAN, and with me today is Andrew Reeves. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be here.
So, Andrew, I came across earlier this year, and it was to my great delight that I came across your work, Andrew, and read the papers that you've written in this area, the area that I'm particularly passionate about. So I thought, why delay? Let's get you onto a call and let's talk to you about, a few things regarding your research and what you think the implications are for where we need to take this. So let's just start introducing you by saying that you're a researcher at the University of Adelaide, and you're currently doing a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And before I get you to talk about the research and what your specific project is, give us some background. It was sort of a little interesting to me how a psych student would suddenly get involved in cybersecurity. So what was the stimulus for you?
Yeah, no, so I get that question a lot, as you can imagine, because I tell people that I'm doing, PhD in psychology, but my focus is on cybersecurity, and people are like, what the hell does that mean? And to be honest, when I first met my now supervisor, and she said that's the area she works in, that was my response as well. I didn't really understand how those two things went together,
right?
Which is really what piqued my interest, I think. So my research group focuses on the human aspects of cybersecurity, which a lot of your listeners are probably already familiar with, but just for those that aren't, the human aspects of cybersecurity is looking at different factors that make people more or less vulnerable to falling for a cyber attack. So it really is something that has quite a strong human focus. Yeah. So, I mean, my way of getting into this area was a little different than most, I think, as I sort of fell into it. I used to work for a large financial institution in their IT area, particularly IT support. Yeah. It was a cool place, like a lot of nice people, but I didn't really like the work much. And so I was my thought was, I'll try something else. I'll go down a different path. And I thought, I've always been interested in psychology, so I'll go down that path.
Mm-hmm.
And that went pretty well until I got to honors, and I was suddenly had the opportunity to work in the cybersecurity space. And I remember thinking, I've done all this work to get out of IT, and I'm now going straight back into it. But no, I think it was a really good opportunity because it really combined the sort of two areas that I'd had experience with.
Well, that makes a lot more sense to me now. I mean, I was sort of hoping that you weren't going to say that you woke up one morning and found that you'd been hacked.
No, not well. Maybe I have, and I don't know yet. But luckily, I've never woken up and had a ransomware attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the nub of, I guess why we're even talking today is,
exactly.
I mean, my own interest in this goes back, to 15 years ago when I remember sitting around the table of I was involved with the Internet Industry Association as the CEO, and because of the position, you often get put on committees as the representative, and I was the sort of, I guess, one of the token industry people on the Cybersecurity Awareness Week steering committee in 2007. And I remember digging up the notes not so long ago, just going through some old files, and there it was, the minutes of the meeting, or the agenda rather, and I'd scribbled on it, behavioral psychology, exclamation mark. I remember thumping my table, my fist on the table, and saying to these sort of senior public servants, look, you've got to understand, people will not stop taking risks simply because we tell them not to.
Yeah.
And of course, fast forward to 2021, and I had a great discussion with you last week, and that's exactly what your research is showing. So let's jump into the research now and tell us a little bit about, what the PhD is about and the work of the group and where you see it all leading.
Yeah, well, so the group I work with are quite diverse in their research interests. My PhD particularly focuses on cybersecurity fatigue, I call it, which is sort of that state that people get into when they're kind of sick of hearing about cybersecurity. They're sick of being told what to do. They're sick of different security prompts coming up. Now I've got to do a two-factor authentication. Now it's time for me to reset my password, all that stuff,
Right.
even though we don't recommend mandatory password updates anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing as well. People are sick of the advice that they get given is always changing. And so they almost end up in this state of just, oh, I just don't care. I can't keep up with this. It's not my problem. This is, and we're particularly focused on employees of businesses.
Right.
So often you'll hear people say things like, oh, we have a security department. They can deal with it. It's not my responsibility. And I think to some extent, what really sort of piqued my interest in this area is I think that people like us that go around saying that we have cybersecurity expertise, and I'm sure we both do, we have some responsibility as well for that, because, and I'm sure we don't fall into these traps, but we go to different, conferences, I'm sure you have as well, where you see people saying, oh, obviously you should be doing this. Or like, it's incredible that some businesses are not doing X, Y, Z. And you sort of go, well, okay, but a year ago, that wasn't the advice. So we have to change this kind of holier than thou attitude that we sometimes get, because that just turns people off. And if we don't, particularly to end users, if we don't acknowledge that we've changed our advice, like that password thing I brought up is an example of that. It used to be classic advice that you must have a mandatory password update every so often. 3 months, 6 months, password will expire, the user has to update it. That's not recommended advice anymore, because there's been heaps of data that's shown that that's actually really detrimental, apart from the fact that people will just increase the number that's on the end of their password, etc. So we know that's bad advice. It would be lovely to see a conversation between, say, CISOs and users that just says, look, actually, we've found out that that advice was wrong, or it wasn't optimal, or it isn't optimal anymore. And so we've updated it for these reasons. Does that make sense? Rather than, here's the process, and we're just going to make that change without explaining it to you. And then, when you do meet organizations that are still using that, trying not to fall back into that attitude of, oh, why are you still doing that? Removing that judgment, I think, is a big part of it.
Stop treating people like drones, in other words.
Yes, exactly.
Respect their need for an explanation sometimes. Respect
that they're people, in other words. I think, and so the application of that to cybersecurity is, and we do, like even my research group, we obviously do a huge amount of research looking at employee attitudes and how that affects their behavior. And we can measure those things in a very high level way. But to some extent, if we really want to make progress, we need to be asking people, okay, here's an individual who fell for a cyber attack of some sort. In that sort of empathetic way, what actually happened there? Like, how did you understand what that happened? What happened 5 minutes before that? What happened 10 minutes before that? And trying to ask those questions in a really non-judgmental way, so that we can actually start to get some real answers. Because if we just go, oh, it was because they were unaware, put them through an awareness training. I mean, that might be useful for some people, but I can't imagine there are many employees nowadays who just don't have awareness. I was actually reading an article of yours, Peter, just before this on LinkedIn, and you mentioned that, I can't remember the exact quote, but you sort of said, oh, I can't imagine there's anyone who isn't aware, but behavior is a different thing. And I think that's really a good point.
Yeah, I think you've picked up on what it was that attracted me to your research in the first place. Was that, I mean, we were as the Internet Industry Association, we were involved with cybersecurity education from about 1999 at least, probably 97 when I started. We saw cybersecurity as being a major impediment to the uptake of the internet, and so we were trying to get ahead of the curve, and we built, a very successful portal for small businesses and consumers. It was launched in 2002. And I mean, to take a slightly different view on your observation about the advice always changing, the thing that was perplexing me over all those years, which I think came to a head in that 2007 meeting where I had behavioral psychology exclamation mark as where we needed to go. The thing that was perplexing me was, why is it that people are still doing the same things now, we can say at least 20 years after we've been telling them not to? And so even where the advice hasn't changed, the behavior isn't changing. There's plenty of awareness.
Yes.
And so what's the thing that, and I love the fact that you're sort of digging into this, because I think this is the question. We will never have effective cybersecurity training unless it's predicated on behavioral change. And then we have to go to the second question that flows from that is, what is required for behavior to change?
Yeah, well, I think that's a real focus area. So my sort of niche of psychology is called organizational psychology, and it's looking at how people function in a workplace. So what motivates them, what builds teams, what makes successful leaders, all that human stuff related to an organization. And I find there's a lot of, to my mind, and we haven't directly researched this, but it would be a really cool area to go into. I think there's a missed opportunity at the moment to apply all that we know about motivating employees to do all this other stuff that we expect of them in the workplace. You know, we expect them to be safe from an OH&S perspective. We expect them to obviously meet KPIs or however they're measured. And, you know, we have so much research looking at how we can motivate people to do that. And there doesn't seem to be much application of that to cybersecurity. And cybersecurity, to some extent, is still seen by a lot of employees. It's something that came out of a piece of research we did last year, towards the end of last year. Actually, I think it's the paper that you read. A lot of people still see cybersecurity as what we would call extra role. So in other words, it's just not part of their core function. It's like, oh, I'll do that if I have time, but it's not central. So if anything, you know, if cybersecurity starts to get in the way of some core task they're meaning to do, they'll drop it immediately. You know, so if a client is waiting on something and the official process is to, you know, transfer documents over a business approved, like cloud-based system rather than emailing it to them, for example. But if the client's waiting and that cloud-based system is giving you issues, they're just going to email it, right? Because their core function is, you know, achieving client needs.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's not new. Like we've had, OH&S has had that issue for decades. So there's so much research that we could apply here, and it doesn't seem to copy across. And to your point, I think one of the things we can look at is what actually people value, but what motivates them in an organization. And that, you know, psychology's focused on that for a long time. Most of the time, people's motivators are broken down into kind of 11 categories. So there's some people are motivated by money, some people are motivated by, you know, a desire to sort of please others or to form new connections in the eyes of others. And everyone will, and there's 11 of these things, and everyone scores somewhere on them. It's not like you are motivated by this or you're not. You'll be somewhere along the spectrum, but some people will be very motivated by money and not so much motivated by, say, the business achieving success. And other people will be the complete reverse. They're not so interested in how much money they receive themselves, but they love seeing results for the business as a whole. And, you know, I think the conversation tends to stop there and people go, oh, okay, well, there's 11 dimensions of how we could motivate people, you know, and it's so specific per individual. So there's no way we could possibly motivate them. So that's it. The conversation ends there. And we just keep doing the same things we already do with cybersecurity training. That's just one size fits all. I think the approach has to be, well, yeah, there's 11 things and people can score all over the place on those 11 things. But as a business, you should be asking, or you could be asking, try to not use the should word, you could be asking, do we have something in place that motivates people on each of those things? You know, do we have feedback mechanisms in our business that mean people are getting that when they are performing the optimal cybersecurity behavior? And you can go down the list.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what's emerging from this discussion, your analysis, and I think the things that we've all sort of quietly been observing here with a degree of angst is that the training programs that are out there now that take that monolithic approach, that treat everyone as a homogeneous whole, are never going to work because of some of the factors that you've explained there. And it seems to me that if there's a single takeout from our discussion so far, it's that we've got to stop treating individuals as if they're a single group, and that we've got to start looking way deeper into the psychology of the individuals within organizations and even at the personal level. And the reason that that's important, I mean, and people might say, well, look, you know, that's a lovely sort of ideal to have, but I'd say that remember this, that, you know, it's a well-worn sort of maxim by now. It only takes one bridge, one individual. So you kind of don't have the luxury of treating everyone the same, because it's that one individual on that one occasion under that one circumstance where the training may have cut in and been effective if those individual behavioral attributes had been addressed. So I think we're talking now about a far more granular approach to training.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. And I think that, you know, some people get a bit scared by that because they go, oh God, are we going to have to measure and interview every person of our 40,000 strong workforce? And it doesn't have to be to that extent. I think you can get a lot further towards the goal by just sort of shifting in that direction. So if you can have a general understanding of the kinds of things your employees are motivated by, the kinds of personality profiles you're working with, and then just set up policies and even training that work with that rather than trying to change that. Because I think that's actually a big thing that cybersecurity, from a human perspective, tries to do. We try to go, oh, this person's really slapdash with their approach to work. How do we make them more conscientious and more detail oriented? An organizational psychologist might say, well, no, that's their personality profile. How do we set things up so that we get the best outcomes from that person? So it's kind of, rather than trying to push a big boulder up a hill, we've already got the boulder up the hill, we just give it a shove and it goes in that direction, right? So I think it's a very different way of looking at it. I think, and it's, again, where the value of psychology comes into it. Because I think that's to some extent what psychologists often do, is people will come to a psychologist and say, oh, I don't like this or that about myself. How do I change it? And, you know, the psychologist would say, well, let's actually have a look at what value those things are bringing. There's probably some good things that are coming from that.
Right.
And so it's not about changing it necessarily. It's about knowing when to lean into it and knowing when to lean out of it.
So you're really leveraging the human dynamic in a way that's far more, what could we say, strategic.
Yes, yeah. Strategic is a really good word. And I think quite a lot of talk in, say, HR departments about strategic human resource management, knowing what skills we're going to need in 5 years' time and hiring on the basis of that now, so that once we have some internal movement, we'll have the right people in 5 years. And to some extent, there's opportunities to do that with cybersecurity as well. You know, we can be, a lot of businesses are already doing some form of psychometric assessment when they onboard new staff. It wouldn't be that difficult to add a cybersecurity part to that.
Yeah, I mean, you've got all these intervention points. You've got these opportunities within at the recruitment stage, at the KPI review stage. I mean, there are, within larger organizations, I'm thinking, it's not that the opportunities aren't there. It's just a question of, firstly, persuading the leadership, I guess, that your humans remain one of your biggest risks in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity risk, in turn, is one of your biggest risks to the organization, and we've seen plenty of evidence of that. Ergo, even joining those two dots, you can see straight away that it's not hard to make the business case as to why, a more strategic approach is warranted. But then the second question is the more difficult one. What does that look like? How do we get to that? Do we have enough research yet that, as you say, we may not know enough yet to explain what the ultimate solution is, But when we talked about this last week, I said, I think our objective needs, and you agreed, was we want to at least start moving the needle on this a little. And I don't think the needle's moving at all. If anything, we're going backwards.
Yeah. And I think it sort of comes back to the point I made where, like, as soon as you start thinking about the complexity of human behavior, it almost seems a bit too overwhelming. It seems impossible. Yeah. And so we go, oh, well, we've already got this particular training program, or we already take this approach to cybersecurity, so we'll just stick with it because we've seen what we'd need to do, and that looks too hard. But what I've really tried to do with my research is show that it doesn't actually need to be as bad as that. Sure, it looks complicated, but it's really not too bad once you get into it. And I think, to your point about motivating the sort of management to have an interest in this, I think that's a really key point, and it's a tricky kind of business case to make, because we can say, look at the risks, and we can say, look at this particular organization that's similar to you, and look what happened. But it's something you've spoken about before, Peter, but there's often such a delay between the action and the result with cybersecurity that it's hard to really take much learning from it. You know, we had an attack, and it's hard to know that we should have done something 5 years ago.
Yeah, this is my proximity theory, that the disconnect between the risk behavior and the risk consequence is often the cause of, and I mean, when I was a teacher, we were taught about educational psychology and the learning behavior. You have to link the desired behavior to the strategy. You know, you've got to create that nexus. And I think when everything went cyber, when everything went online and remote, and you know, we can have another discussion. I think we had a nice chat the other day, and I was we were talking about the evolutionary drivers of behavior and the fact that our limbic system is not optimized for a virtual world. It's optimized for spatial and temporal proximity. And I think this all comes into bear. But I mean, to a non-psychologist or someone that doesn't really have much of a humanities background, perhaps they've come in through, you know, business or engineering, IT, to be having these discussions, as you say, can be a little daunting. But I really think we're at the point now where we just don't have any option, Andrew. I think this is not a nice to have. This is the direction in which cybersecurity education must move.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you raise a good point about the almost how we frame the business case when we talk to organizations, because we tend to say, oh, and even I did it a second ago, we say, look at the risk, look at what you'll lose. And to some extent that's valuable, again, particularly for the people who are motivated by certain things, that might work. But we're already doing that. The other side of it is that we can start to frame cybersecurity as a benefit and start to focus on how it actually benefits the organization's strategy. So if we know what the organization's strategy is, we can align it to it. But again, this is something that's been done in other areas of organizational psychology for decades, and particularly OH&S.
On the OH&S example, it's an interesting one. I think the game changer there was actually regulation. When laws came into place that made OH&S, you know, a mandatory requirement for businesses. And of course, we're seeing that now with cybersecurity in the financial services sector. We've got the CPS 234 prudential regulation, which is now mandatory. And the government just this week has announced that they're going to be extending directors' liabilities within the area of cybersecurity. So I don't think it's going to be hard to get the attention of organizations. I don't think that's the challenge. I think we're going to, it's almost like making the business case. Fortunately, the government's done the hard work for us. And they're getting a compliance issue now.
Yeah. And I guess it has to be compliance in a way that doesn't come across to your end users as though it's just compliance for compliance sake.
Exactly.
That's one of the really big things that came out of that same paper we wrote last year. Was that, again, it's understanding that your employees are thinking, feeling people, and they can detect when they're in a training program or a process has changed that's just floated down from a compliance, oh God, we've got to do this perspective.
Right.
And as soon as they get that sense, particularly in a training program, if they're sitting in a training program and they detect that they're only here so that a box can be ticked, essentially, that's the phrase that keeps coming up. It feels like a tick box exercise. But if you are going to do that, I think it's really critical to not make it obvious that it's from a compliance standpoint, because you know, people have license to disconnect immediately as soon as they feel that. Yeah. So as you've said, there's been a lot of legislative changes recently. So if you were to roll out as an organization, if you're going to roll out a training program right now, I feel like people would know.
And so what do you think about, I've seen a few sort of papers out there talking about reward. And I mean, within psychology, the whole, you know, Pavlovian conditioning, basically around the context of rewarding and positive reinforcement. Do you think there's a role within that you've seen within the research for, and have we seen any effective programs that reward positive behavior change within the cybersecurity sphere?
I know there's been quite a bit of research that's looked at rewards and punishment together, and it's pretty well accepted that punishment doesn't do a whole lot.
Right.
Rewards, on the other hand, I think can have a role, particularly in sort of habit forming. You mentioned, you know, Pavlov and the story of Pavlov's dogs, where they, you know, would learn to salivate when they heard a bell. I mean, that continued even once the experiment had finished. Like, you know, the habit has already been formed, and habits will diminish over time, but you've made some effect. So yeah, I think there can be a role with that. And I think the reward sort of goes back to my point of what people value at work. So the reward is going to be different for different people. But if you know the main categories that people tend to be motivated by, you can set up a reward system for each of those things. And you don't have to start from scratch, because for most businesses, you'll have a particularly small, you know, some medium to large organizations. You already have a lot of that. You'll have a lot of reward systems in place.
Right.
But it's just about adding cybersecurity in there. And the other thing to remember is that, you know, cybersecurity is a process. It's not an end goal. You know, it's the other sort of attitude change I think a lot of cybersecurity experts need to address, is that we don't know everything. So we will try something. It will or won't work. That's okay. We just see why that didn't work, and we try something else next time. And it's this constant iterative approach, because obviously the threat actors are constantly changing their approach too. So yeah, there's not going to be a point where we say we did it, we're cyber secure. It's constantly this iterative thing. And yeah.
Sorry, I sometimes wonder whether threat actors are so well resourced now that they themselves will be recruiting behavioral psychologists to move to the dark.
Well, yeah.
There's no question that they have a pretty good understanding of human behavior and psychology already. Maybe it's instinctive to the criminal mind, but they're adapting quickly around a lot of the standard sort of defenses.
Look, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are people who have a human behavioral background working in this area. There's other things, but that first point of entrance is often human, right?
Let's move forward now. Andrew, we are still in the midst of a pandemic. It seems not to want to go away. And one thing that we've all observed, and that certainly the statistics bear it out, is the increase in cyber vulnerability and cyber attacks that have occurred during the pandemic period. And we've built some training ourselves around what the particular exploits are looking like that are targeting some of the human vulnerabilities that are tied to the pandemic. But when we spoke last time, you were talking a little bit about stress as a factor. And I wonder if we could just take a minute to delve into this thing of the system 1 and system 2 thinking, and how that maps to the COVID environment. I mean, I think it's a nice sort of piece there that we could sort of explore.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, as a quick overview, system 1, system 2 thinking is a dual process idea of how people make decisions in particular. And I tend to use systematic versus heuristic rather than system 1 or system 2, just because I think it's more descriptive of what they actually mean. But systematic processing is when you make a decision that's very deliberate, effortful, you take your time. So these are the decisions you probably think of when I say you made a decision, right? Because they're the ones where you actually spend some time going, oh, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Whereas heuristic decisions are the ones you make on the fly, and to some extent you're not committing them to memory, so you don't always know you've made them until after. So there's a really basic example. Sometimes you will have driven somewhere and you've navigated the whole way there, but you get there and you go, I don't even remember driving here.
Right.
That's often, heuristic processing, because you're just doing it intuitively, essentially. And it's not, good or bad which one you're using, but there are two ways that you process things.
The idea of rational, deliberative, calculated reason thinking on the one hand versus intuitive.
Essentially, it is a divide between what you might call, cold rationality and the more intuitive approach.
Right.
And the understood reason that we function like that is because there's just so many decisions we have to make in our day-to-day life that we can't possibly sit there doing it systematically the whole time. So our brain has to make a decision. Okay, are we going to process this systematically, or are we going to process it heuristically? And often you'll process something heuristically until there's some stimulus that tells you otherwise. So it's a very sort of natural thing to have. And it applies to cybersecurity, because often for everything you do at work, a lot of it ends up being heuristic, particularly when you're, say, actioning and replying to emails and things like that. You're doing that so often that rather than looking at an email and going, okay, is this legitimate or is this phishing? I can see here there's this and here there's that, so maybe it's not real, etc. You're not doing that. You open the email and you get an intuitive sense of real or fake. And that's picking up on some of the same cues. So maybe you go, oh, okay, this seems fake because that word's misspelt and I don't recognize this person or whatever. But knowing what those cues are can help threat actors, it can help threat actors get past that first barrier and make people actually fall for these emails. So one of the other people in my research group, that's their whole focus, is looking at susceptibility to phishing emails on a basis of sort of influencing techniques, because it's all about trying to encourage people to use heuristic, quick, intuitive processing rather than using systematic, because then you've got a bit more chance of getting through. And there's a few ways you can get people to use heuristic processing. And you mentioned one, stress. Pretty much in any situation where your brain doesn't have the resources to dedicate to systematic, it's going to use heuristic. So if you're in a rush, if you're really tired, if you're stressed, if you're scared, you're all going to use heuristic. And so that's often the angle that a lot of these phishing emails take, because they'll try to, scare you. That's common, right? Your account is locked, or you've lost this money, or, the idea is they're trying to scare you in the first couple of seconds of that call, so that the rest of your actions are less rational and more, oh, I've just got to do something. To some extent, it's nice to say, oh, yes, you should be aware, and slow yourself down. And that's often been the focus of a lot of research recently. But what we looked at was, okay, here's a group of people who aren't tired. Here's a group of people that are. We gave them a cybersecurity task, and we looked at what bits of their behavior changed and what didn't, right? And certain things didn't change. So that's the sort of risk with just battering at the door with awareness and pay attention. And you go to these cybersecurity things that say stop and think, right? Really valuable sometimes, but sometimes it also means you've made it worse.
Sounds like what you're saying is that when people are operating in a non-heuristic way, in a deliberative way, then changes in the internal state, tiredness, stress, fear, and so on, are more likely to have a negative effect on their decision making. And so, but if they're operating in the sort of semi-automatic mode, the heuristic mode, then that's more resistant to the kind of
Yeah.
human influences that an organization isn't going to be able to control.
In that situation, if we went straight to, oh, that employee was an idiot, why didn't you check in? How do we get that person to slow down their thinking and be more systematic?
Mm-hmm.
It's 4 p.m. on a Friday. We're pushing the boulder uphill there.
Yeah.
So rather than judging that person, we empathize with them and go, okay, what was their world like at that time? You know, we actually understand that, yeah, they're tired, right? That's going to happen. So can we realign the process that works with that rather than against it?
Yeah.
Because I know some researchers that look at how experts make decisions. And once they understand how an expert makes a decision, how do we then teach non-experts to make similar decisions, right? And often there's a focus on, say, firemen. That's a really common example, because you'll get these situations where people who've, been firemen for decades can walk into a building, obviously that's on fire, and they've got their team with them. And suddenly they stop and they go, okay, everyone out. And they all run out, and then the building collapses. And it's not that they're psychic, it's that they've been in there 100 times. And so they know these tiny little cues. It's a creak here. They've noticed that wall's a bit cracked, and they're doing it heuristically. They're not doing it systematically.
Right.
And they get this feeling of, no, this is wrong, get out. And then if they go back and think about what they were doing systematically, they can start to identify, oh, yes, it was this and that. But in the moment, it was an intuitive feeling. And that's a fantastic thing to have. We shouldn't be telling that individual, be more systematic. No, that heuristic process actually was very valuable there. The trick is, though, that you develop that intuitive heuristic process by having constant and repeated experience in the situation where the feedback is immediate. And again, it makes perfect sense with firemen, right? You know if you've stuffed it up pretty quickly because suddenly you're trapped in a room, or suddenly one part of the building goes down, you didn't realize it did. You get very immediate feedback. They know pretty quickly whether they got it right or not. What's tricky is when you're making decisions where the outcome of that decision is 5 years from now.
Right.
And it sort of goes back to your point that we're not super hardwired to be able to learn from those decisions.
No.
We can if we really, focus on it, but it's not going to be that sort of intuitive decision making. How do we transfer the skills of that guy or woman who's been doing it for 20 years to the team that have only just started? And how do we transfer that in a way that's quicker than just getting those people to do it themselves for 20 years? And it sounds hard, but there's a whole wealth of research that's looking at doing exactly that, but not in cybersecurity that I've seen.
Well, just lead to the obvious final question, which I suppose, is almost the inevitable consequence of this discussion. And that is, to pose the question, are humans up to the task at the end of the day? I mean, is it too complex, or are we really talking about AI, artificial intelligence, but with the superior processing ability, with the cue detection, on steroids compared to what a human could do? I mean, is that really where this is? Are we ready to admit defeat yet, as far as the human's concerned? Or
I don't think so. I'm always a little skeptical of that, because I've heard that argument before, and then obviously I've only been in this industry for the IT industry and then cybersecurity industry for like 10 years. But I feel like that's something to some extent that has been said for I don't know how long. You can go back to the 90s and see articles that say technology is now too powerful, we need to get humans out of it, or whatever. It hasn't happened yet.
Asimov said it in the 60s. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, we can address certain types of crime, but there'll be new ideas and new ways and new opportunities, and there'll always be people who are willing to exploit those opportunities. So I think that goes back to what I was saying about cybersecurity being a process, and also acknowledging and communicating that to regular employees. So we say, this is a process. We're going to keep testing our ideas. We're going to keep changing our advice. So be aware of that, and we're not going to judge you if you're still using old advice that we told you to do 2 years ago, because that's understandable.
Andrew Reeves, it's been great talking to you.
Thanks, Peter. It's been
I'm sure
fun.
this is not the last discussion we're going to have on the topic. I mean,
Hope not. Yeah.
we can go forever on this stuff.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate that. And I think this sort of what you're doing here with these getting people engaged, I think that's a huge part of that, because really part of what we're doing right now is trying to communicate knowledge between people. So the more platforms we have to do that, the better.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a believer, so you can rely on it. Thank
Fantastic.
you, Andrew. Well,
thank you.
Andrew Reeves from the University of Adelaide for the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, and it's Peter Coroneos signing out.